My name is Chris Holdgraf. I'm a researcher at UC Berkeley and a founder of the nonprofit 2i2c. And today I want to quickly go through a few new developments in the publishing ecosystem around Jupyter and the tools surrounding Jupyter. In case anybody is curious to follow some of the links that I'll have in these slides, you can find this slide deck at this URL. So the goal for today is really to just give a short update from a couple of different projects and highlight a few things that might be worth paying attention to in this space. As everybody knows, one of the core goals of Jupyter from the beginning was to support publishing and scholarly workflows in the research and academic community. And over the years, we've seen a lot of tools evolve. We've seen this space become much more complex and diverse. And so I'm just going to let a few of these projects talk about some of their updates today. So we're going to hear a little bit from nbconvert, we're going to hear a little bit from Jupyter Book, and we're going to hear about some new infrastructure projects from the Pangeo community. But first I wanted to mention just a couple of projects that we're not going to dig into here, but that might be worth watching in the future. So NeuroLibre is a new infrastructure project from a Canadian team in the neuroscience community to build a reproducible interactive publishing toolchain that uses Jupyter, as well as BinderHub. Ioxa is a new startup that focuses on building open source tools and services around online writing and publishing tailored for the scientific community. And you can find their poster 064 at JupyterCon in the next couple of days. 2i2c is a new nonprofit created by the leaders of several projects in the research and education community that use Jupyter infrastructure. And the nonprofit's goal is to provide Jupyter infrastructure for other communities in research and education, including for use cases in publishing. Fast Pages is a new, easy-to-use blogging platform that uses GitHub, Jupyter Notebooks, and has a lot of interesting features around writing your own content and inserting interactive material into it. And EarthCube is a community in the earth sciences world that have played around with an interesting prototype for building publishing with Jupyter Notebooks pipelines into their proceedings and to their community's workflows. And you can see a link to their JupyterCon talk in the slide deck there as well. So just a couple of interesting things that are worth checking out. So on to some specific projects. The first thing that I want to talk about really quickly is nbconvert. So as many of you know, nbconvert is one of the earliest tools in the Jupyter ecosystem. And its primary goal is to take Jupyter Notebooks as input and then convert them into some other output format. So that might be something like HTML, it might be something like restructured text, Markdown, PDF. You can output live reveal JS slides, so sort of interactive slideshow slides from Jupyter Notebooks. And recently nbconvert had a major release that had some interesting new changes and a couple of important deprecations worth noting. So the most important thing to note is that there is no longer Python to support in nbconvert. So starting with 6.0, Python 2 will no longer be supported. Yay! The next interesting thing about nbconvert 6.0 is another thing that it doesn't do, which is that it no longer controls the notebook execution process. For many years, we've dreamed of splitting the execution piece of nbconvert into its own standalone package, and that now exists. It's called nbclient. And you can find a link to its documentation there in the slides. So nbconvert can still execute notebooks, but it relies on this more tightly scoped, lightweight package nbclient to do so. So I recommend checking that out. It should make it a little bit more, easier to maintain, easier to use and understand, and hopefully a little bit more streamlined for people that just want to execute notebooks, but don't want to have notebook conversion tools. There's also a new PDF exporter for those of you who want to generate PDFs, but don't want to do it via LaTeX. There's a web PDF exporter that allows you to keep a lot of the styling that you would expect in a more traditional Jupyter Notebook or Jupyter Lab interface, but rendered in a static PDF form. And then finally, probably the biggest change in nbconvert 6.0 is a new templating system. So this new templating system is much simpler to understand and simpler to use and build new templates for. It draws a lot of inspiration from the Voila ecosystem and how their templating system works. And effectively now you can install a template on your machine by just placing those template files in a folder that is in one of the Jupyter data directories. So basically a Jupyter data directory can now have an nbconvert folder in it. And inside of that folder, you can now put the templates that you want your nbconvert process to have access to. So this means you can do really nice things like pip installing a template directly. So you can define a template and release it via a GitHub repository. And when a user pip installs it, you can set up that template to just dump the files into the proper data directory and users can use it straight away. So that should make that process much easier as well. And I have a link to the templating docs at the bottom of this slide as well if you want to learn a little bit more. So there are a lot of other things that have changed in nbconvert as well, but I recommend that you check out the documentation and the changelog to learn a little bit more about some of the stuff that's been going on there. And as always, we would love to see your participation and your support in the nbconvert project moving forward. Okay, next, I'm going to give a talk, but it's going to be in a different video, about an entire rewrite for Jupyter Book, which is a tool for publishing collections of notebooks and Markdown files as an online or PDF-based book. And I'll let that video run now. My name is Chris Holdgraf. I'm a researcher at UC Berkeley, as well as a founder of 2i2c, the International Interactive Computing Collaboration. And today I want to talk a little bit about some new publishing-focused features that are a part of the new rewrite of Jupyter Book. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about these tools and following some of the links that are in these slides, you can check out the slides for this talk right here. Before I go any further, I just want to quickly give a shout out to the broader Jupyter community. This is a large, diverse open source community that has contributed in many ways to many of the different pieces of Jupyter Book underneath the stack. And ultimately, none of this would be possible without all of those contributions. So thanks to that broader community. And specifically, I want to say thanks to some of the leaders on the Executable Book project. This is a new collaboration that is stewarding Jupyter Book and also putting in a lot of development and a lot of support to the various tools in this ecosystem. So thank you in particular to these collaborators. So really quickly, what is Jupyter Book? The goal of Jupyter Book is to allow you to take a collection of Markdown files and Jupyter notebooks and share them in a book-like form, whether that's as an HTML website or as a PDF document. So oftentimes you'll have collections of both Markdown and Jupyter notebooks, and really you can use any kind of markup file as well, but I'm going to focus on these two. And maybe these files make up a textbook, or they make up some course materials, or they make up a lab notebook. And what you want to do is share that content with collaborators or with users or with students in a more accessible book-like form. And that's basically what Jupyter Book is trying to do. So here's an example of a collection of files on the left, and then a kind of nice looking interactive book structure over there on the right. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about how Jupyter Book itself works and how to use it, but if you want to learn more about that kind of thing, I recommend that you check out jupyterbook.org, which contains the documentation for the project. So really quickly, why am I giving this talk specifically about Jupyter Book and publishing? Well, in January we started, and in about May or so we completed the first phase of an entire rewrite of the Jupyter Book code base. What Jupyter Book used to use was a combination of nbconvert and Jekyll in order to convert notebooks into HTML and then stitch them together as a website. And the new version of Jupyter Book is built entirely on Sphinx, which brings a whole lot of benefits along with it. The way that Jupyter Book works is it begins with your raw content files. So you point Jupyter Book to, say, a folder with a collection of these files inside of it. And this can be Jupyter notebooks, Markdown files, restructured text files, anything that Sphinx knows how to read into it. Jupyter Book will then convert those files into a form that it can execute, and it will execute and cache any computational content that's in those files. So by that, what I mean is that the first time you build a page, it will execute all of the code on that page and cache the results. And subsequent times that you build that page, you won't have to re-execute unless you've changed any of the code that's inside. The next thing that Jupyter Book does is it builds a rich document model of the different pages in your book as well as the references between them. And it uses the Sphinx documentation engine for all of that magic under the hood. It also does things like inserting the outputs of running that code directly into the pages, resolving references, bibliographies, things like that. And then finally, Jupyter Book can output a variety of different kinds of output files, either an HTML website similar to a static site generator, or things like a PDF through LaTeX. So that's a really short overview of Jupyter Book and what happens kind of under the hood when you build a book. And for the rest of this update, I want to just share some interesting new features in Jupyter Book that I think are particularly relevant for publishing. So probably the biggest new addition to Jupyter Book is support for a new flavor of Markdown that is called MyST, or markedly structured text. The goal of MyST is to take all of the best features of restructured text, which is a very common markup language in the Sphinx ecosystem, and bring them into the Markdown ecosystem so that you can get the power and the flexibility of RST, but using Markdown for writing your actual documents. This brings with it a lot of different additions, a lot of new kinds of syntax that you can include with your Markdown, although it builds on top of Common Mark at its core. So what this means is that any Jupyter notebook that uses the default Jupyter Markdown will also work with MyST and thus will work with Jupyter Book as well. But if you want to do some new kinds of things with Jupyter Book, then you can do so using this extended syntax of MyST Markdown. The most impactful new addition to MyST over a Common Mark Markdown is something called roles and directives. And roles and directives are similar to functions, but in Markdown rather than something like Python or R. They have names, they can take arguments, you can parameterize them with different key value pairs. And in so doing, you can control what happens in the final rendered output in your book. So on the left, I'm showing the example of how you structure a directive. On the right, I'm showing how you structure a role. And here are examples of two of these things as they would actually be used in your book. So say you want to insert a figure into your book. You can use the figure directive. Its argument is a path to a PNG file. And then you can add things like a caption, a label that you can reference later on, as well as a name for your figure by using key-val pairs. And then on the right, I'm showing how you could make a reference to that figure somewhere else in your text in the book. So this lets you do some really interesting things that aren't possible in Common Mark Markdown. And one of the most common ones is to specify blocks of content to have certain kinds of meaning. And so by that, what I mean is you can explicitly insert tips or warnings or notes into your book's text. So here I'm showing you an admonition. And by tagging your content as an admonition, you can create, a special little box around it that highlights that content. You can control things like the color of that content. And this is just the beginning. You can do a lot of other kinds of special content blocks with MyST Markdown as well. The other thing that I mentioned is that because Jupyter Book has been rewritten for the purposes of publishing in many ways, you can now insert citations and bibliographies directly into your book's content. So by using a bibtec file, you can cite pieces of that file and then insert bibliographies at the bottom of a page or really wherever you want to. And that also works collecting citations across multiple pages as well. So if you want to have a separate page that's just for the bibliography, then you can do that. You can also insert citations and references to just other parts of your book. So on the left, I'm showing you how you can attach a label to a section of your book. And then on the right, I'm showing you a few different ways that you can then reference those labels elsewhere. So let's say I want to reference a section that's on a different page of my book, but I want to make sure that the label that I use will remain constant, even if I change the title of that section or I move it around. This is what you can use labels for. So you can really easily reference other pieces of your book so that users can jump to different content as you wish. You can also use directives to insert things like figures and to format those figures and to ensure that they look just the way that you want them to. So here I'm showing you an example of how we can add a caption to a figure by pointing to a local image file on the machine. And when the book is rendered, it will be rendered as if it were its own standalone figure. And similar to the slide that I just showed you, there's actually a special reference role that you can use to point at figures and allow users to jump directly to them. And I should also mention that while I've been mentioning Jupyter Notebooks and Markdown files as two kind of separate things in this talk, another thing that Jupyter Book knows how to do is actually convert Markdown files into Jupyter Notebooks. It also uses MyST Markdown to define that syntax, but what you can do is write your Markdown file, but structure it as if it were a Jupyter Notebook. And this allows you to then store your content in a more Git-friendly or collaboration-friendly format as just a raw text file. But then when your book is built, Jupyter Book will convert it into a notebook and execute and cache all of its content as if it were an IPynb file. And the other thing that I should note is that I've been focusing on a book sort of context thus far, a multi-page context, but Jupyter Book also knows how to just build individual files or individual pages as well. So for example, if you're writing a paper and that paper is just encapsulated in a single IPynb file or a single Markdown file, you can build just that file using Jupyter Book and get all of those features around, references and citations and figures and whatnot. So the next thing that I quickly wanted to cover were a few new additions for things like reproducibility and interactivity that are going to be useful in a publishing context. The first thing that I want to re-mention is that execution and caching now happens at the moment that you build your book. And so this is important because you want to make sure that the book's content, and in particular, the results of executing the computations in your book's content, are up to date and will actually work given the current environment that you're using to build the book. And using this execution and caching functionality, you can be confident that your code will actually run when you've built your book. Moreover, we're using a caching mechanism that makes it so that you don't make redundant computation and waste time in building your book each time you build it. And it'll try and be smart about only re-executing content if code cells have either been changed or rearranged, which helps you be a little bit more confident that if you've changed something in your content, then it should be reflected in the outputs for your actual published book. The other thing that you can do, because we have caching and execution, is actually take the results of executing a computation. So for example, if I'm generating a figure with matplotlib, I can actually save that figure and then insert it onto another page of my book using a role called glue and a figure called gluing. So here what I'm showing you is an example of how you can insert that figure into the text. This is the syntax that you would need to use for the glue figure directive. As you'll see, I'm referencing a key that I've stored when I actually ran the Python that generated that figure. And Jupyter Book knows how to find that key, grab the figure associated with it, and then insert it into the page somewhere else. And in this case, along with adding a caption and adding a reference so that I can refer to it later on. So this is kind of an interesting experimental feature at blurring the lines between your interactive Jupyter Notebook environment and a final published document. We want to make it easier for you to draw connections between those two things for the sake of publishing and reproducibility. Moreover, you can also, if you want a fully interactive environment, connect your book content with online cloud infrastructure, or even with a local Jupyter server if you wish. So here's an example where on the Jupyter Book page, there's a button called a launch button that connects to a Binder instance, so that a reader can just click that Binder button and be taken directly to a live, fully interactive Jupyter environment that is serving the Jupyter Notebook that's underneath this page. So Jupyter Book knows how to build pages from Jupyter Notebooks, and if you then host those Jupyter Notebooks on GitHub, you can directly connect users to interactive versions of those pages via Binder or Jupyter Hub or the Collaboratory. And then finally, one of the really interesting experimental features in Jupyter Book is trying to bring some of that interactivity into the static page. This uses a really interesting tool called pynb, which is a JavaScript library that takes a static code block on a static web page, requests a kernel from Binder in the cloud, and then turns that static code block into an interactive code block that you can run and see the outputs for using that Binder kernel under the hood. So by using a little wrapper called sphinx-thebe, we can bring that functionality into Jupyter Book. So that allows you to include a button on every page of your book that takes all of your code cells and then converts them into interactive cells so that users can play around with the code on that page without ever having to leave that page on their own. Okay, so that's it in terms of the new publishing features in Jupyter Book. As you can probably guess, there's a lot more going on under the hood than just what I've been able to talk about here. But these are some of the more high-level publishing-focused features that I think are really exciting in this space. So if you're interested in learning more about how to use Jupyter Book yourself, I recommend that you check out jupyterbook.org. If you're interested in contributing to Jupyter Book, if you have an issue or a feature request, or if you'd like to contribute some code, then you can check out executablebooks.org as well as the Executable Books GitHub organization, which is where most of the code for this is happening now. As I mentioned before, Jupyter Book is an open source project and it's run entirely from an open community with maintainers that are very much like yourselves. And we would love to have your participation if you're interested in pitching in. And finally, if you're interested in chatting with me a little bit more, you can either get in touch by asking questions around the Jupyter community forum, or that's my Twitter handle at the bottom there. So thanks very much for listening to this quick update about publishing with Jupyter Book. And I'm excited to see what kinds of things you all do with the tools. So thanks very much. Okay, that's it for Jupyter Book and its rewrite. The last thing that I want to do is allow Sebastian Alves to talk a little bit about an interesting infrastructure project coming out of the Pangeo ecosystem, which is not explicitly focused on scientific publishing, but is a really interesting approach to using infrastructure for the purposes of making it easier to both publish and discover interactive content and along with Jupyter Notebooks, leveraging cloud infrastructure and the sort of broader tool chain that Pangeo is well known for. So I'll let Sebastian take it away now.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this talk about the Pangeo Gallery. My name is Sebastian Alves. I'm a data scientist at UW with the Applied Physics Lab. I work on a lot of different aspects of Pangeo, including infrastructure, documentation, and I've worked with Ryan Abernathy a bit on this particular project, so I'm excited to talk to you about it today. To start, we'll talk about how this project kind of came about. And so if you've heard of Pangeo, you might have been or still be confused about what Pangeo really is, and you wouldn't be the first. But Pangeo was first and foremost a community of scientists trying to get their work onto the cloud. And to this end, Pangeo people have contributed to or developed packages to work with data on the cloud. And in an effort to help other scientists get there, you'll do a lot of writing of documentation, give talks, that kind of thing. But when it comes to these software, it can be tricky for new scientists to really onboard themselves if the examples are really basic. What we've kind of found is that people would prefer worked examples being domain specific, preferably to their domain, so they can really learn what's going on. And so that's what the gallery is hoping to accomplish, is just be a gallery of all these different worked examples for how you can use specific packages or infrastructure in the Pangeo stack. Now, if I go into the Pangeo gallery, I would find a lot of little panels like the three you see here on the bottom. They have little descriptions. It's very nice. And so if I were to click on the left one, I would get taken to a page like this on the right. There's a lot of simple information here. It's got some concise descriptions. You can see the repository where this content actually is hosted. There's 4 little badges there to describe the license, the last time this example had a change, whether or not it's being built successfully, and then a binder link. We'll talk more about that binder link later. And so for this particular tutorial, we'll see that there's only one notebook. And if I clicked on that link, I'd get taken to a completed notebook. And so the Pangeo Gallery has this notebook fully rendered. It's got all the outputs for the code that is run. And it serves as a very good fully worked example for using this Landsat 8 data on AWS. Now, there's the binder link, which we leave there because we're already running this on a binder hub. And so it would seem silly to not allow visitors to the website to run the same thing. For this particular example, we're running on a binder hub that we set up on AWS. So it's not mybinder.org, but it's got a Pangeo link in it. And if you go to that binder link, you will launch this image that we've specified for the example. We've got Dask enabled, so you can set up a Dask cluster and run the computation through that. And you'll be able to go through the example at your own pace and change things as you want and really dig in. Now, how do we get all this set up? So the gallery is supported a lot by this package called BinderBot. And BinderBot is mostly a way for you to talk to the binder programmatically. It's written in Python, and we usually containerize it inside a GitHub action. So if you wanted to set up a new gallery to put on Pangeo's gallery, you'd create a little GitHub repository. You'd have to connect it to the Pangeo Gallery's GitHub repository as a one-time thing. And then once you've uploaded your content, this GitHub action with BinderBot will automatically go to the binder hub that you've specified. It'll run the notebooks. And once it has those rendered notebooks, it'll save them back to your repository and then push that rendered content to the Pangeo Gallery or whatever gallery you wanted to point it to. And this has a lot of easy customization, right? First of all, you can customize the image like repo to Docker, as Binder Hub supports. You can pick whatever Binder Hub you want. You can set it to a different gallery repository, but right now we're just using the Pangeo one. And it works pretty well. It's as soon as you've set it up the first time, you generally don't have to go back and mess with it unless you've had an error in the notebook execution. And there are a bit of some picky things that BinderBot isn't quite good at doing yet, but it is very young. And so looking forward, we are committed to this being open source. So if you want to add entries to the gallery, we're more than happy to help you work through that. There's a contributor guide you can go through. And we welcome additions to BinderBot. If you want to make it better, if BinderBot can support more than one gallery, we'd be ecstatic. And then since this is a broader conversation around publishing in the Jupyter ecosystem, we're curious if you think this can be a useful tool for publishing notebooks more broadly. Can you incorporate peer review? And how do you deal with quality artifacts and data dependencies? And I'll just leave you with a few links here for Pangeo Gallery related things. The gallery, its repository, BinderBot's repository, and the contributor guide. Thank you so much for coming to this talk, and see you at Q&A.
Okay, now that we've had a couple of updates from nbconvert from Jupyter Book and Pangeo Gallery, this session is over. So I want to leave a couple of links here in case you want to follow those and learn a little bit more about any of the projects. You can find the link to the nbconvert, the Jupyter Book, and the Pangeo Gallery documentation there. All of these projects are open source projects, and they would all love your participation and your support and your input, whether that is suggesting features, reporting bugs, or making code contributions. Really anything that you can offer is really helpful and is really appreciated. So you can get in touch with me there at the bottom, or you can connect with the broader Jupyter community at the community forum at discourse.jupyter.org. And I look forward to seeing you next year to learn about all the new cool things that have happened around publishing with the Jupyter ecosystem.